guys, and welcome to Minimalistik. So it's been a while since I made a video. I've been moving in the past weeks and made a few DIY projects while doing so. And today's video will be about one of these projects. So I got myself a new tabletop from IKEA, the Jerton, and I stained it. And while it looks really similar to the IKEA Carl buy, it's cheaper and completely made out of wood instead of being a particle board. It's also deeper and not as wide, making it more suited for a desk in my opinion. And finally, it features pre-drilled holes if you want to use it with regular legs. So I hope I convinced you, as we're gonna check out how I did this. This project was greatly inspired by Alan Jimenez on Imgur, so I'll leave a link to his album in the video description. Here we go. So although the box says you shouldn't use a knife, I did. You know me, I'm such a badass. As for the whole staining process, I used my trestle legs to make sure my fellow friend here didn't leave too much air on the desk while it dried. The first step was removing the sticker that left a mess. I almost gave up at that point. Luckily, the next step was sanding, and it would get rid of what the sticker left behind. So I used 220 grit sandpaper. The surface is kind of rough and unfinished. There's no oil or any other product that seems to be protecting the wood. This step does help a bit to start with a smooth surface when the sanding steps in between polyurethane coats will occur. So I gave a good amount of sanding until everything felt smooth with my hand. Remember to sand in the direction of the wood grain. After sanding the bottom, I cleaned all the wood residue off the surface with a damp cloth. Then I flipped the tabletop over and did the same sanding and cleaning process. Don't forget to do the same thing on the sides. As for the staining process, I used an oil-based stain by MinWax in a dark walnut color. They say on the can that you should prepare the wood with a conditioner, but I didn't. I like the result as it came out, so I wouldn't advise you to do so if you like what you see. Basically, it can help the stain to penetrate the wood more evenly. I also recommend you use old newspaper or anything like that to protect your floor, as small drops will fall on the floor. And make sure you're in a well-vented area, like not inside an apartment with a single window. The stain smells really strong, and I felt a bit dizzy after a few hours. So I applied a generous layer on one side using a 4-inch stain brush. I tried to apply enough stain so that it would soak in the wood to the point where some would stay on the surface. Then I also did the sides, and it looked a bit like this after being done. And you might say, well, Simon, there's way too much stain. But don't worry, that's completely normal, and that's exactly what you should do when staining wood. So after 5 to 10 minutes, I used the cloth to remove the stain excess. It then looked like this. I was happy with how dark it looked, but if not, I could have simply applied a second layer the next day. So I let it dry overnight.
24 hours later.
So I flipped the table over and did the same thing on the other side. By the way, it's quite heavy. I have pretty big muscles myself. So yeah, be careful. I also used some cloths on the trestles to prevent any damage to the finish. So I applied a thick layer of stain like the day before. Then after 5 to 10 minutes, I removed the excess and cleaned up the sides as well to prevent any stain drips. I probably should have used painting tape to prevent this. So after removing all the stain excess, it looked like this, pretty much the same thing as yesterday. Again, I let it dry overnight and came back tomorrow for the polyurethane finish.
24 hours later.
For this step, I used the semi-gloss oil-based polyurethane finish by MinWax. I recommend you use a stain brush again to apply it. Also, make sure you don't shake it just before applying a coat, as you'll end up with bubbles in your finish. So I applied a thin coat of poly all over the surface and the sides, making sure no spots were left behind. Then I ended up with long and steady strokes alongside the grain of the wood to reduce the amount of bubbles and imperfections. Also, make sure you clean up the underside of the tabletop, as some polyurethane drops will probably have formed. So this is what it looked like after a first coat of poly. This is the underside of the table, so a single coat will be enough. Letting it dry overnight, and we'll do the other side tomorrow. And don't forget to wash your brush with a paint thinner or mineral spirits or maple syrup, I guess.
The next morning.
Using 320 grit sandpaper, I sanded the coat I applied yesterday just to make it smoother, again going in the direction of the wood grain for better results. I then used a damp cloth to remove the sanding dust. It looked pretty decent. I flipped the table over, struggling with its weight, I mean, look at my face, and I applied a coat of poly. It was pretty much the same thing as yesterday, finishing with long strokes alongside the wood grain and getting rid of droplets under the table. I also gave another coat on the sides. So here's how it looked after the first coat. There was some imperfections, but I gave 4 coats in total and sanded in between each of them, so no worries here. Again, letting it dry overnight, and I will sand it tomorrow. So I gave it a light sand using 320 grit sandpaper again. I did the sides as well. Then I removed all the dust using a damp cloth and applied another coat of polyurethane the same way I did yesterday, finishing with long strokes. Here's what it looked like just after the second coat was applied. There were still some imperfections, but there will be less after each sanding between coats.
Early the next morning.
So the next morning, I gave another coat the same way I did the day before. This time, I tried to sand the surface using 600 grit sandpaper, but it was a bit too fine and became dirty real fast. I went back to the 320, but I'd suggest you go for something a little finer as it can leave some scratches in the final result. So after applying a coat on the surface and the sides, then finishing with long strokes, here's what the finish looked like. It started to look really good, so I only gave a last coat after this one.
5 hours later.
I only waited about 5 hours until the next coat, so here's what it looked like, all dried up after 3 coats. So I did the same process that I did for the other coats, making sure every part was covered and imperfections were kept to a minimum. So this is what it looked like after the 4th and final coat. So I let it dry for a few hours and then I installed my PC setup, did a quick cable management pass, and installed the lifx LED strip. I have to say, I'm quite happy with the result. It's not perfect, there's a few cat hairs stuck in there, and the finish is not always even, but overall, it looks good. When not looking up closely, it's really clean. I also like the size of the desk, there's a lot of room whenever I need it. And it's really solid compared to the other cheaper tabletops from IKEA. There's no flex at all, even with my heavy monitor arm, so that's great. I could have applied a few other coats and then polished the surface, but I felt like it was enough. I plan on buying sit-stand legs someday, and this tabletop will be an amazing surface for that project. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below what are your next DIY desk projects. And don't forget to subscribe to Minimalistik for more tech videos.